Welcome, students, to Lecture 8 of MHHS 1. Last time, we examined the big picture argument of Antoine Lentacker's essay, Powers of the Script, Prescription and Performance in Turn-of-the-Century France. And that big picture can sort of be boiled down into what changed historically about the prescription and what stayed the same at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. The historical change is what we learn from the essay is the shift from individually formulated prescriptions to the prescribing of ready-made drugs or patients just learning about drugs from mass media advertisements. Now, one might think that the change would be for the better in many ways. One might think that before, with those individual formulations, there would be things like error, quackery, and hucksterism, depending on the whims of the prescribing doctor. And after that historical change, there would be objective measures, dosages, and formulations that precisely matched the symptoms of illness with proper treatment. What we learned from the essay is that one would be wrong in that case, according to Lentacker's analysis of the continued performativity of the prescription. Rather than abandoning that performativity for a kind of medical scientific objectivity, physicians merely changed the dramaturgical stage directions of their performances. They just adapted the performance for their times. Now, in today's lecture, we'll get some scenes to show the mechanisms of that adaptability. We'll get very concrete examples of how those performances were tweaked and perfected through changing media technologies rather than just abandoned at the turn of the century for medical objective scientific progress. There was always a certain amount of wiggle room that allowed for the development of that adaptable performance. And so since we talked about the first and last sections of the essay in the previous lecture, sections 1 and 5, we'll tackle sections 2, 3, and 4 in this lecture. So the kind of detail-oriented parts of the essay. So if you think about it, this is just sort of like the 5-paragraph essay that you were used to writing in high school. Sections 1 and 5 are the introduction and conclusion, respectively, and sections 2, 3, and 4 are the body paragraphs. Today, we'll be directing our attention to those concrete examples in sections 2, 3, and 4 in those body paragraphs. Section 2 begins with a weird-looking title that I'll take some time to explain because you were probably confused by it. It's called Medical Advice in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility. So it might look weird because Lentacker, I think, is just assuming you know Walter Benjamin's famous essay with the usual title, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So that's the usual English title that I'm familiar with from the English translations that I've read. But the original German title was Das Kunstwerk im Zeitalter seiner technischen Reproduzierbarkeit, or The Work of Art in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility, first published in 1935. Now you can see where the title comes from. Lentacker has just replaced the work of art with medical advice. Okay, so we have another interlocutor here. All right, so why is Walter Benjamin important? Benjamin was a Jewish philosopher in Germany who grappled with both the rise of Nazi propaganda against Jewish communities and the flourishing of mass media technology, of mass media as a technology to distribute information and misinformation with frightening efficiency. So his object of study in the essay was the work of art, das Kunstwerk. Since these mass media technologies were so efficiently distributing anti-Semitic propaganda, Benjamin was understandably wary of these technologies of mechanical reproduction. He argued that there was, quote, an aura of uniqueness around a work of art that was lost in the decontextualized mechanical assembly line reproductions. So that aura of the original unique work of art in the citation that you get in the essay is a, quote, strange tissue of space and time, the unique apparition of a distance, however near it may be. So just to get you to understand Benjamin's strange formulation here of this aura of the original, just think about a concrete example. So take this oil on canvas painting of Gustav Klimt's The Kiss from the early 20th century. So what do you think, and this is a genuine question for you, is the difference between going to Vienna, to the Belvedere Gallery in Austria, paying the €15 entrance fee or whatever it is now, staring at the original Klimt painting, or buying this $34.99 poster from Target? Is there an aura of the original that is lost in the Target poster? Is there a point to going to Vienna and seeing the original? Benjamin emphatically says yes, and so do I, but does so with oblique abstract terms like aura, strange tissue of space and time, and a paradox of distance and closeness. So it's something inarticulable that he wants to pinpoint. He just knows there's a kind of loss in the age of mechanical reproduction. So in section 2, Lentacker tells a similar history of mechanical reproduction in the development of ready-made drugs and the proliferation of drug advertisements. He goes through centuries of history really fast, so let me just remind you of that really fast history. He starts with the specialized expertise of early modern guilds. The French Revolution of 1789 then created a kind of medical anarchy in which medical authority was a democratized free-for-all, but then quickly Napoleon stepped in with codes about medical professionalism and legitimate training. So this is the prehistory from early modern times, maybe 15th century to the 18th century, to the French Revolutionary period, 1789 to 1804, to the Napoleonic era, 1804 to 1815. So that quick and dirty prehistory allows Lentacker to arrive back at his cold open with Dr. Brouardel and his notions of medical authority and professionalism. The prescription was meant to be unique. It was meant to have the aura of an original in the way that Benjamin talked about an original work of art. But then something happened. Quote, advertising wrested the written word from the protected space of the manuscript page. And physicians began to get worried that their original art was starting to lose what Benjamin mysteriously called, quote, strange tissue of space and time. So we can see that mechanical reproducibility in the images, we can see that mechanical reproducibility in the images of cough medications in figures 1 through 4. Once the first cough medication was successfully advertised, a bunch of others just started copying that message because it was successful. Even the mechanical reproduction was being mechanically reproduced. It became a copy of a copy of a copy, and so on. Physicians mounted legal challenges to what they saw as unlicensed medical advice, but the advertising age largely triumphed. The age of technological reproducibility meant that there was an even more urgent need to clarify what, quote, what that strange tissue of space and time actually was. So the section ends with a bunch of questions that those physicians were probably asking themselves. What is special about the moment the physician interacts with the patient, writes a script, and hands it to them to fulfill at a future date? Advertising made it all the more urgent for physicians to think about these issues. Section 3 moves on from the perspective of the physician who is trying to deal with the advertising industry's mechanical reproduction of the prescription. Now, we arrive at the scene of the late 19th century pharmacy. Now, this history begins also in the French Revolutionary / Napoleonic era with a pharmacy law in 1803. Quote, pharmacists will not dispense compounded drugs or any medical preparations unless prescribed by doctors of medicine or surgery or by health officers and solely on their signatures. So Lentacker notes that this law was general and clear enough to survive well into the 20th century, but there's a lot of wiggle room here for interpretation, even in this seemingly airtight language. It seems innocuous enough. It didn't specify if prescriptions could be repeated, for example. If they could, it didn't specify how many times. It didn't even really specify what constituted a signature. So there was a lot of wiggle room, a lot of play in that law. The last section emphasized the new landscape of drug advertisements, and this section instead concentrates on the advent of ready-made drugs instead of custom-made, individually compounded drugs. For these custom-made drugs of the past, there was, as Benjamin might have put it, more of an aura around the originality of the prescription. And it makes sense. It was a unique prescription that was tailored to a specific patient at a specific time and place. There's that aura. That tailoring of the unique recipe was protected by that law, but the law really didn't have much to say about who could take those compounds and how often. That only really became a problem with ready-made drugs. In the age of technological reproducibility, there's really no need to have such deference to the unique, specific time and place of a prescription. Drugs are now completely reproducible commodities that could just be repeated again and again as long as someone wants it. And here comes the wiggle room that I've been talking about, and an issue that has a lot of contemporary relevance, and that's morphine and opioid abuse. You've seen these headlines recently. These pharmacy laws didn't have provisions to think about access to these drugs. Neither the physician nor the pharmacist wanted to be the bad guy or have to do the dirty work of policing access to these drugs. There were some criminal cases and penalties enforced for the overprescription of drugs, but neither physicians nor pharmacists were clamoring for stricter legislation. Nobody wanted to deal with this. Physicians, as Lentacker explains, quote, saw some degree of flexibility as indispensable given the expectations of the public. So they frequently just sent patients off with no instructions about refills. Patients could just refill as they saw fit. So this goes to the very nature of the performance of prescription as a kind of authoritative interaction between physician and patient that gets deferred to a future date. It is, in Lentacker's words, a kind of, quote, ethereal writing that relies on a performance of authority that gets deferred indefinitely. Both physicians and pharmacists didn't want that dirty job. They didn't want that job of saying no to patients who are seeking treatment. So even after the advent of ready-made drugs and drugs of abuse like morphine, that performative wiggle room was something that the medical class wanted to preserve. Section 4 is another section with the theme of the more things change, the more they stay the same. New laws had to be written in this age of ready-made drugs and potential drug abuse, but that, quote, blurriness at the edges that Lentacker talks about of the Prescriptive Act persisted throughout this evolving history. The new pharmacy law of 1845, remember the old law of the early 19th century, this new law of 1845 said that pharmacists had to obey a certain set of standards with enumerated classes of drugs. Classification became the latest, but definitely not greatest, method of preventing drug abuse. Certain classes of drugs were meant to be completely traceable. You could now trace when a prescription was written and when the drug left the pharmacy with a patient. The pharmacist was tasked with keeping a detailed archive of the ins and outs of certain classes of drugs. And you can see a cool example of this in the image in figure 6. So you might think that would be a really good way of moving away from the kind of wiggly performativity of the prescription and toward a more objective correspondence of symptom A to drug B. Classification, after all, is supposed to match these things together with a grand sense of comforting order. But no, that doesn't happen, right? If only. The only change that Lentacker identifies here is that prescriptions now had an intensified graphic performativity. So the performativity now depended on a whole host of new enacted gestures of power that just included more metadata, more graphic metadata, dates, places, pedigrees, and authenticating marks. We learn about some physicians trying to use stamps. Maybe the new technology of the typewriter could prevent forgeries. Maybe the prescription pad with clear identifying marks of the prescribing physician could create that objective matching of symptom and treatment. But as we learn from the many examples in this section, these things never became, quote, legal requirements because they never actually worked perfectly. And that in part was the point of all these moments of graphic performativity. These are all things in the quest for the unfalsifiable script, but that quest could also be self-defeating at times. There's always, quote, indispensable room for play. We never arrive at the unfalsifiable system, and that allows for some flexibility in how we think of the relationships among physicians, pharmacists, and patients. So without the insights, without all these insights of this essay, you probably thought very little about the act of prescribing drugs. After all, it is just an ephemeral bit of business between seeing your doctor and getting your treatments at the pharmacy. Surely things have been figured out by now, and there are eminently logical and rational guardrails to prevent all kinds of malfeasance. Surely by now, all the lawyers and doctors have figured that out. So maybe we might have thought that there was a kind of dark ages when these things didn't work so smoothly, this 19th century, but now things are much more advanced. But with the insights of this essay, Lentacker's essay, we can now understand that the genre of the prescription has always been a genre that relied on a kind of performativity, graphic or not. We might think that our system now perfectly matches a chart of symptoms to a chart of drugs in a perfect one-to-one correspondence. But as the essay shows us, we are not so far from this long history of scripted performances. The performances have just changed with the times.